So it did go for the Core XY type of printer in which the nozzle moves. I have previously covered the ChatGPT 5.1 release, which was about a week ago. However, they had not released ChatGPT 5.1 Pro until I think like a day ago. So for today's video, we're going to be going ahead and doing a full focus test of ChatGPT 5.1 Pro. Now, honestly, there's really not too much to actually go over in terms of an introduction for this model, being that the only mention that I saw from it in terms of like an OpenAI specific announcement was right here in the release notes from November 19th, stating that ChatGPT 5.1 Pro is clearer, more capable, and better for complex work. So really the only announcement here was like, hey, it's a better version of the Pro model. So with that, we're basically going to just jump right into testing this model and seeing how well it stacks up, considering its relatively steep price point of $200 a month in order to even access this model. For the first test, we're going to do the new, more complicated test, which is the 3D printer simulation test. Essentially, the model is tasked with making a web-based simulation of a 3D printer. It should be as realistic as possible, meaning ideally a result would have the print head actually moving around and putting layers down on the build plate, emulating the actual functionality of a 3D printer. Now, ChatGPT 5.1 Pro is something that historically, at least for my testing, has taken a very, very long time to think through answers. So I am going to I've allocated a large block of time for this test, assuming that some of these answers that we do may take north of 10 minutes to actually complete. Now on the right side of the screen here, we can see that this is actually showing some level of its thought process. So I will inevitably have to move my head somewhere else on the screen so folks can actually keep an eye on this. But really, I'm just going to let this time lapse and we'll see how it does. We'll see its thought process and then we'll test the actual generated result. In right around 7.5 minutes, we have received our result here. So I'm really not going to spend too much time looking through the actual non-code that it generated here. I just want to run it and see how it is, but I'm going to scroll down just to get a feel for how lengthy the script is. So it does seem fairly lengthy. If you'd like, I can also extend this to show a ghosted target object so you compare the in-progress print to the final shape. Okay, well, that is not part of the initial prompt, so I won't judge it, but it is cool to get further improvement suggestions from the models as well. All right, let's take a look at our result. All right, well, that is obviously a bit disappointing. I am just going to test it in Firefox, which is likely not going to produce any difference in what we get here. So because this is so disappointing and because this is just a test of a single specific model, I think that I'm actually going to go back in here and we'll see what exactly is wrong and then have it go ahead and fix that. All right, here's the supposedly fixed version. This has a very 5.1 aesthetic to it. Now, obviously, okay, I should kind of address the elephant in the room, which is it still doesn't work. But the UI did get changed, so that's good. Unfortunately, the downside of that would be that it, as I had said, doesn't work. Let's just try now for the third time to gently nudge it towards the correct solution. All right, so I've just said to it, hey, we're still having this answer. I think you can do a little better. Or we're still having this error. Okay, last chance. Thank you. All right, this is exactly what I was looking for. So it did go for the Core XY type of printer in which the nozzle moves. Well, the bed would only move up and down. I don't expect this to actually have the bed moving. I'm wondering, is the nozzle moving up? It is. All right. Overall, this is decent, I suppose. The nozzle does have a tip, so all right. And then, cool. All right, let's reset. Good. So we've started from nothing. Let's do a circle. Beautiful. Okay, so the Z seam will be right here. I mean, that... All right, this did what we asked. It took a little longer than it should have, but let's try. Very good. Okay, so we have a very high-speed printer here now. Let's do it slow. And then we can actually fast-forward it as well. Okay, the final thing we have not tested, which I do believe kind of tripped up Gemini. It did it properly, but it kind of had some weird zigzags in with it. So let me go ahead and kind of speed this printer up a bit. This is not bad. This is not bad at all. We have a nice little emulated 3D printer right here that is properly doing a triangle. Though it did take a while to get it right. And overall, the scene, is acceptable. There's some blue lighting obviously coming from somewhere in the top of the scene, which we can't see. Let's do like a POV shot. Nice. Now for the historic browser-based operating system test, we're just doing the classic HTML, JS, and CSS, generate a browser-based OS, giving the model complete freedom in terms of however it decides to go about doing this. Interesting, I'm still not getting okay, good. The chain of thought is back here, so it seemed to have gone away after I swore at the model, but aside from that, it does seem to consistently show up, which is nice to see. In 7 minutes and 46 seconds, we've received our browser OS, so let's just go ahead and take a peek at it. Yep. This is the GPT aesthetic. They do very much like dark purple, like dark blue gradients. Okay, it opens with an about page, light and dark theme toggle, draggable, focusable windows. Ooh, that's an eloquent full screen, probably one of the better full screen results I've seen. So we have a clock down here on the bottom right. No right click, so that is still a rare thing to see. Let's check out our start Nova OS. All right. Well, let's see if dark mode works. Nice. Nice, very good. That is what you would expect for this price point, is having a functional dark mode in your... All right, let's check settings. Oh, I was just there. Notes. Very good. And auto save. So that's cool. I mean, it would just save it in like browser storage or persistent storage. I don't recall off the top of my head what that's referred to. Okay, a fake file system for demo use, to-do.markdown. Does this actually render in our Notes app? No, unfortunately not. Okay, so these are just kind of for aesthetics, as this whole test really is. I guess you could make the argument. Finally, we have just the about. So interestingly light in terms of the applications, but as folks have pointed out before in the tests, I don't necessarily give it much other than just make the WebOS. So when they do sometimes make additional apps and stuff, that is kind of on the model. So I have devised a test. Here we have an 8.5 by 11 piece of printer paper, and essentially I have drawn 2 lines on it, 1 line down and 1 line across. I really hope that the camera does actually pick this up. I timed how long it takes me, just averagely like drawing with my hand, how long it would get to go down the page and across the page. So I've just tried to ask it essentially what this test is going to be, which is here's how long it takes me to draw fully across and fully down on this piece of paper. Using this time information, please instruct me on how I should draw the word hello. So I'm not 100% sure how it's actually going to go about do this. Ideally, and kind of what I mean by that is what I would assume is it will say, okay, draw down for 1 second, and then, or no, because hello would just be, this may be a flawed test now that I'm realizing when I actually run it, but I would assume like 1 second for the first line in the H, and then it would tell me to move up, and then half a second for the between the letter H, and then move over, and then A. Okay, we're just going to see what this does. Now this is very interesting, and I'm quite happy to actually see this result, where it basically said it's impossible to properly solve this. It didn't just try to solve it with bunk information, it just stopped and said, hey, your problem is insufficient to actually allow me to produce a response, which this is a positive in my opinion, because oftentimes a big complaint with models, which I personally haven't experienced a ton, is that they'll just make things up and lie. So this prevented itself from doing that and said, your puzzle does not give me enough information, therefore I can't really answer. But it did give us a little bit of pertinent information about how to proceed, at least on the user's end. So while this test may have been kind of bunk in and of itself, which I did not fully realize until I sent the prompt to the model, it did respond in a way that I am satisfied with. To give you a specific sequence like up for 1.3, right for 0.9, I'd need details that are not specified. Cool. Well, I will amend this prompt to be more clear for the models to solve, but consider this to be a new like logic math test, I guess it could be said, and I will work on it. I'm now going to give this the bumper car test, where it is designated with giving us a 3D bumper car simulator with the POV from the driver inside the car. It should give us some Rick and Morty style kind of flair to the test, so whatever you make of that, we'll see how this interprets it. And then finally, it needs to have the toggleable GigaChad mode, in which when enabled, any car we hit goes absolutely flying off the map. I do have a bit of concern that we may encounter a similar or same issue that we did with the printer simulator, but Yes, so I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume that is going to be the exact same issue. And honestly, in the interest of time, I want to be clear, this would be a failure in terms of the result. So me giving this a second chance here is purely because the video would kind of suck if I just tried things and nothing worked. And then we basically had not a lot to show in terms of visually cool things, but I'm giving it a second chance here. But keep in mind that I would consider this to be a failure were we doing a head-to-head model test. So we'll just kind of see what it does here. Unfortunately, it has instructed me to do manual work, which I suppose would be a good thing for like the electricity considerations of using AI. However, for our testing, it is not ideal. So I will begrudgingly go ahead and fix this, and then we'll try it one more time. Well, unfortunately, that was just a failure because the fix it actually instructed me to perform still did not do anything. The error no longer shows up in developer tools, but sadly, the game does not appear. Now, as this model is also touted as being able to help with more creative and business use cases, I want to give it a question here that may be somewhat difficult to answer, kind of in line with the dropshipping reseller category. So here I have specifically told it that I purchased 500 retro gaming handhelds from Alibaba, which for those unfamiliar would basically be something like this. There's a bunch of different companies or different designs here that get sold, and you can see the price, which obviously would be a little bigger depending on how you negotiate it or something of the sort. But I have asked the model that I have these handhelds. I need a way to market and sell them that makes them unique comparatively to all of the other sellers offering basically the same exact thing. I have told it that I can modify them in two special ways. One would be a custom 3D printed external enclosure to fit over the stock case. This would add $6 to each of my unit cost. Finally, a custom external packaging with kind of like a brand or something like Black Label, I believe would be the term. This would add $8 each unit to my cost. And I told it the original cost of how much it was shipped to me as well as how many units I have. So we're just going to go ahead and see how it does here. Obviously, this is a test that is more difficult to judge the result of, unlike the WebOS or something like that, but it may be of interest to see how it creatively decides to market something that would be rather difficult to do so on its own. All right, I've gone through this result, so let's just look at some of the highlights in my opinion, keeping in mind that these are harder to judge because the results would be more subjective. So it basically told us to make 3 different types of products. It said don't spend that additional money on every single unit, but have different tiered ones. So essentially there will be 200 of these that I keep just the same way they are, and then I sell those locally on Facebook Marketplace or something like that. Then there should be a subset of the total amount that I have that I should 3D print cases. So as we see right here, the tiered list, which I'm referring to. So there will be a base one right here. It's telling us to sell it for between $30 and $35 when our initial cost landed was $17.35. And then here's how you differentiate it even without mods, just basically saying that each console is hand tested before being sent out. And this is again working with something that's kind of hard to do anything original with, being that this would just be equated to a dropship. But that was interesting. Tier 2 is the custom shell edition, which is of course the additional $14 or whatever I'd said, not 14, like 8 or 6 or something for the 3D printed shell. And I like it. It said, name them fun things like Neon Night, Glacier Clear, Pixel Pink. Put a tiny number label on the back or inside box to make them feel more special. And I found this to be kind of interesting. Each shell is 3D printed and hand finished in-house, so small variations in texture make every console unique. It's kind of like saying like, yeah, it's 3D printed, so it's going to look jank, but it's a unique thing. It's not a bad thing. So that was good at least. And then it just talks about selling them like with good photos and things of the sort. And then finally, our third tier, which would be the most expensive one, we have the gift box / collector's edition, which has special units, puts like maybe some additional things in the box, like a sticker sheet or something with your logos. And then it says, be smart about IP, but you can have like a retro 80s, 90s vibe for the packaging. And then Pixel Pal, or it was just kind of funny. The angle here is buy this as a gift and you're already done. It already feels special. Then it gave us a bit of information about our branding as well as sales channels, which was kind of cool to see. So it even mentioned specifically Facebook Marketplace, which can work for some local things like this. Etsy for the more custom editions, and eBay and things of that sort. It did give us a fake origin story, which was awesome to see right here, where it says, I love retro handhelds and started customizing these for friends. That's not true. Now I'm doing small limited runs, printing and assembling each shell myself. So, you know, kind of works. And then it just gave us a quick step-by-step action plan for essentially a summary of everything it gave. So again, this is kind of a different test, but just a way to see how it would ultimately make something out of nothing, which would be trying to distinguish a dropshipped product which has a lot of carbon copy competitors. I'm now going to ask it for a Python coding test, but because I want something visually interesting, assuming this does work, I'm asking it for a flight combat simulator game. Now, this is a bit different than the one I did in a previous test in terms of the actual instructions I've given the model, but basically the core concept of it is it should show a first-person point of view from inside the cockpit of the fighter jet. The WASD keys should be controlling the jet. The ammunition should show trace effects when you shoot, so you can actually kind of keep track of visually where it goes. There should be 3 enemy planes in a round, as well as a health bar for the player in the top right corner. If the player defeats the enemies, it just basically says, congratulations, you did well, and the game window should abruptly close. On the other hand of that, if the player loses, it should show a somewhat insulting message to the user about their lack of skill, and then the game window will close anyway. So it will overall perhaps be an interesting result, and I have told it can use any dependencies that it would like, so we'll see if it gets exotic at all in terms of like the packages it decides to use. Okay, we've received a single script using Pygame. It gives us the instructions on how to install Pygame if we don't have it, as well as just what it put in, which is basically what we asked for, including the dismissive insulting message if the user loses. So let's check this. All right, let's check out our... Okay, well, it's not exactly what I had expected. I did not specify... Let's see if they... Okay, I didn't specify 3D, so I can't be too dismissive. Let's just see if our health goes to 0. Mission failed, your flying skills are embarrassingly bad, and then... Okay. Very good. Now make it 3D. Which is obviously a relatively difficult ask, but considering it does have a foundational functional script to go off of, perhaps it will go the extra mile and make it 3D. In a little under 7 minutes, supposedly we have a result, so let's check it. I have high hopes. These always take a little while to open, so that shouldn't be held against any model you see using this library. All right, well, unfortunately, that was disappointing. Now, I understand this prompt is obviously rather lackluster, but being that we did just give it a rather verbose page mainly focused on graphics for vintage or retro racing games, I figure it's acceptable to just tell it to make a racing game using that as a reference point. Now, this is obviously a coding test, but that doesn't seem to be the strength of this model, so consider this also to be a somewhat of an instruction following test, or even the ability to reference information and then use it in the answer it comes up with, being that there is a lot of interesting information on that page, and if followed properly, it should be able to produce a relatively impressive retro-style result. So in just over 12 minutes, which I do believe is the longest that we've seen this think in any of these tests so far, it did give us a generated result here. I noticed it mentioned it doesn't have any like peaks or valleys, which is somewhat disappointing, but we'll just try it. Okay, we can move forward. Wow, that speed is quite significant. 400 kilometers per hour is definitely nothing to scoff at. The road is drawn in a cool manner. Now, obviously, there are no curves or anything like that, but it does seem that this has somewhat adhered to at least some of the information, whether it be exactly or stylistically, that was contained in that website. We can't go backwards, and you can see that there are some kind of retro graphics here, so this may look less impressive than I view it, because I think this is actually kind of cool and could definitely be expanded upon, but again, this was just more of a test to see how it did when given a specific style that we wanted to capture. So if we scroll down here, we can see if we find anything that looks kind of similar, and perhaps not too much, but the chain of thought will have been visible throughout this. I will just time-lapse it so you can get a better reference point for what it was actually trying to do. So for the final test, I'm going to try giving this something that I think is a little more in its wheelhouse, which is to say this is likely best at research things or for folks in maybe higher educational positions where you need a bunch of really weird information to be gone through and brought together and then presented to you in a concise and palatable way. So using this for coding is definitely not 100% fair, but I was truthfully a little disappointed in some of the results we received in some of the coding tests, but this model is more poised for research and like eccentric thinking tasks. So this query that we've asked it right here is give a realistic breakdown of to what extent one could use off-the-shelf hobbyist level equipment to perform Van Eck phreaking on an HDMI cable. So Van Eck phreaking is basically like using the electromagnetic signals that are emanating from a specific cable to decipher information that is actually going through that cable. So obviously this is something probably more exotic, but in a hypothetical scenario with the right equipment, it can be used to almost like wirelessly, but you probably have to be pretty close, capture information from a cable. Now I'm asking it here for this in terms of how a hobbyist could do it with hobbyist equipment on an HDMI cable, which is very likely not super possible. So I said, if that is the case, at least give me some breadcrumb of how we could capture something from a cable with hobbyist equipment. In a little under 6 minutes, we received our answer here, and this is something that I did just quickly scroll through to make sure it was like decent. But aside from that, this is the way that I find this model performs its best. Is I have an issue, these are the tools available to me to solve this issue. Go ahead and research the potential pitfalls and how I can go ahead and solve this issue within the bounds of what I have available to me. That is where I feel this model excels and where it is very likely supposed to be used. Not necessarily in like make me a bumper car game, although that's more fun. And truthfully, I would have expected it to do better than it did in this testing. But regardless, it basically said it's going to be very difficult. This is much closer to a university lab research project than a weekend hack, but it did go ahead and also cite some research papers here of just things of note, and it uses those to kind of culminate its answer. Obviously, a lot of models can do web search and cite sources, but it goes on, like I suppose what goes on behind the scenes here and actually using the information it finds. So it gives us that, okay, flat panel displays and digital interfaces do leak enough to reconstruct coarse images. It mentions a team in Uruguay put a broadband antenna very close to an HDMI cable, fed that into a mid-range SDR, and used heavy signal processing plus deep learning to reconstruct text from an external monitor. But again, this is very likely like a very research-oriented thing, and as it said, not a weekend hack project. And it goes ahead and does answer the second part of my question, which is, okay, if I can't specifically do this, what can I do? Think of it as tiers. Is there a monitor and what's it's doing? This is easiest and very realistic with hobby equipment, so that is actually kind of cool here that it gave us this bit of information. Then tier 1, and it gets a little more kind of complex as you go down. So overall, I'm not going to read through the entire verbose explanation here, as these sorts of tests are of course harder to judge, but this just highlights, in my opinion, one of the strengths of the pro models from OpenAI, which are as research assistants essentially. It did also mention, of course, legal and ethical considerations here, and basically ends with a TLDR, which I'm going to just leave here for a second as I speak, so anyone interested can just go ahead and look at this TLDR. So that's going to conclude our first test of GPT 5.1 Pro. I will say truthfully, I was not 100% blown away with its performance in the raw coding related tests we performed, but as mentioned here in the release notes, it is especially helpful for writing data science and business related questions. So in some of the questions we asked it in terms of more research oriented work, it seems to perform quite well. Overall, I suppose I don't really have a lot to say, which seems to be more or less like common at the end of some of these videos lately, but it performed strongly in certain categories. But I will say in the coding categories, I was almost a bit disappointed with how it was giving errors, and even in one of our earlier tests where we gave it the specific error from the developer tools in Chrome, and it did not actually properly fix it the first time we gave it the specific error. I would have expected it to do so there, but overall, this is kind of a more research-focused model. It does definitely seem, so keep that in mind when judging some of these results, but I wanted to go ahead and test this, being that I have access to it, and it's interesting. So with that, that is going to wrap up today's video. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments, and thanks for watching.